There's this feeling that comes in, it's in everything, every, especially artistic endeavor, is this imposter syndrome feeling of like, am I actually good at this? Should I actually be spending my time doing this? Is it worth the effort?
Greetings and welcome to the Creative Writing Wizard podcast, where we talk with published authors and writers to learn more about them, their writing process, and their books. Today I am joined by published author Drew Weatherhead. Welcome, Drew, to the podcast.
Happy to be here, Glenn. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so for those listening in, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, as far as my authorship goes, I've self-published a couple of treatises. One, my first book in 2023 was called Consciousness, Reality, and Purpose. And in 2024, I produced another one called Layers of Truth. And they're mostly philosophical treatises going into very broad topics, obviously by the names. But they're big thoughts that I like to think about. And then this book that we're going to be talking mostly about today is going to be coming out at the end of April. I think by the time I release this podcast should be available to the public. And it's my first foray into the fictional world, which I was very excited to do because it allows me to not just talk about topics, but present them in a way that is more of a story than speaking at the reader,
Yeah, and it's pretty cool to see your progression as you've been, growing in this author space. I guess one of the first questions I had, and I think you touched a little bit on this on your Substack, is you have the two books out already talking about like the philosophy side of things. What led for the transition into trying something from more the fictional perspective?
There are a lot of big thoughts that you can just put out there, just point blank and say, this is the thought, this is what I think, what do you think about that? Or think about that yourself. And that appeals to a certain analytical mind. The problem being, if you want to try to get your thoughts more broadly out there, you're really shoehorning yourself into a small niche community of, thought thinkers. It's like that meme about philosophers. Hey, what do you want to do? I want to think about thinking. It's a very niche thing to want to do to begin with, let alone vibe with. So it doesn't actually limit, though, the value of the thought. So the question then became, well, how do I get it out to a wider audience? Because, I can't force people to like something that they just don't have an appetite for. Well, it turns out, and this is something that I discovered in my own thought processes in the writing of the first two books, is that humans almost universally communicate through story. That is the easiest, lowest hanging fruit because it is everything about how we communicate. We don't actually communicate in data or in numbers or in, parcels. We communicate in stories, in emotions, and in experience. So what I found when I came to that conclusion was a lot of the great authors and thinkers of the times that I was digging into, whether we're going into the 1800s or the 1900s, big authors like Tolkien or C.S. Lewis or Nietzsche, they actually, although they had their treatises and they had their philosophies that they laid out explicitly, all of them had phenomenal and are most well known for their phenomenal fictional work. So I saw that as a bellwether for the direction that I should be going. If I want to reach a broader audience, it is to get into story and it is to present human level philosophical quandary in a fictional realm where people can have an experience. And that was C.S. Lewis's takeaway too, is that fiction is more about giving people an experience and then allowing them to percolate their own thoughts.
Yeah, I like that because I know certainly one could think like, oh, this is a book that's written for a philosophical purpose. But like you mentioned, is like when I read the story, there's certain themes and certain topics that you touch on, but you kind of present it in such a way that you let the reader kind of come to their own conclusion to an extent of like, what do you think about this situation? You present, this is the environment, these are the actors that are going on within the scenario, but then not really like saying whether or not it was like good or bad, or you have characters reacting to situations. And I know one of the key influences to this book you mentioned really early on in the preface is the Attack on Titan was like a really heavy influence on that. So can you talk a little bit about how Attack on Titan inspired this specific story?
Sure. No, I love this. It's such a left field for most authorship, especially probably less so nowadays because anime is really coming into its own in the last, I mean, really since the pandemic, everybody was kind of sitting at home binging things, and anime has so much to binge, you know. And I had a friend turn me on to Attack on Titan, which is started off as a manga, which is sort of a comic book in Japan that got really popular and popular enough to start making an anime, which took a long time. It took something like 7 years to produce the 4 seasons that culminated in about 92 episodes. But the story is just phenomenal, and I find it's a crying shame that there's going to be so many people in this generation that don't ever get this story because they won't watch an anime. They won't watch a cartoon because they're so mature, you know. But it has such a vibrant and thought-inspiring and disturbing storyline to really sink your teeth into. And the way that he built it, Isayama built it, the author, was in a very thoughtful and secular manner where you actually don't really know what the story is until the end. And the whole time you're trying to build out, well, what is actually happening here? There's so many mysteries and holes and key plot points that seem vacant or absent. What's going on? And then they start to drop them in like little truth bombs near the end of the story. In fact, the very first episode of the anime is called To You 2,000 Years in the Future. And the 80th episode is called From You 2,000 Years in the Past. So it takes you 80 out of the 92 episodes just to get the actual storyline behind the first episode that leads into the entire thing. And so I've watched it through 2 times, and I'm probably going to watch it through a 3rd time. It's such a amazing example of just very phenomenal story writing, in my opinion. And it's the thing that both inspired me as well as motivates me to try to raise my level of writing to that level. Because I'm going to, I started writing out this first book knowing the basic layout of the entire series, which is going to be 4 books in the same way that Isayama had 4 seasons. And I want it to be secular, and I want it to be expanding through every iteration so that you see the least amount through the first book and then a little bit more through the second book. And by the time you hit the 4th book, you want to restart it at the first one because now you understand what you were reading the whole time.
Yeah, and I definitely felt like while I was reading through the book, there are scenes that like I could imagine it kind of like in that anime style of like the high intensity, high impact moments of like just even visualizing it, I could see it, in that Attack on Titan style. And I like how you mentioned that of like that you don't necessarily explain everything from the get-go, and that you kind of put pieces along the way so that as the reader is getting into the story, they kind of grow in a sense of understanding, but then also more questions. Like I feel like by the end I still have a lot of questions about what's going on, but in a good way of like, oh my gosh, like what's going to happen next. And another interesting thing that you did with the book is you included these little like tidbits at the end of each chapter, some kind of like information, and that was also inspired by kind of like the Japanese storytelling. Can you talk a little bit about like what led you to do like that as well?
Yeah, that was something my editor was very confused about when she was reading through it. She's like, I've never seen this in a novel. Why are you doing this? And I'm like, okay, well, it doesn't come from typical book writing. It comes from anime. And I wanted to do it for that reason. The word inspire means to breathe in, right? And it's this idea of ideas or a semblance or an inspiration being breathed into you, or you're ingesting something that is external to you beforehand. And I feel like if I'm being properly inspired by something, I have less to do with what I'm writing or how I'm writing, and more to do with trying to give deference to the thing that I breathed in. And coming from the place that I was inspired through Attack on Titan and through broader anime in general, it is a trope in anime that either at the halfway mark of an episode where there'd be a commercial break, there'd be some sort of information. It's even in manga, when you go through the comic books, they'll have like little pages where it says like some background on a character or some background on the town they're in or some background on this and that or this technology or this idea. And what I found is that really added some fascinating lore to the intaking of the story in a way that I wanted to add that myself. And so at the end of every chapter, my book is broken into 3 acts and a finale. And in each individual act, they will have a different type of tidbit at the end. In the first act, it's called Notes from the Acolyte. Now, you don't even know what an acolyte is until the 3rd act. So again, like it's sort of confusing until you finish it as a whole. The second one is Musings of the Watcher. Well, you don't even know what a watcher is till halfway through Act 2. And then the last one is Scatter's Journal, which actually starts to pull a lot of these things together. But the idea is that I'm going to give you a little bit, as the reader, I'm going to give you a little bit more information than any of these chapters are going to give you, which then sort of colors the background of the chapters that you're reading so that you can be a little bit more invested into the universe that's being built around you. And by the end of it, again, like I really think that the second read through is going to be more valuable to people than the first one, because they'll see things like, oh, this is what he was talking about halfway through the book in that part that didn't make sense, or vice versa, back at the beginning of the book that I forgot about, and now I understand. And there are things in those tidbits that literally are not explicitly written into the book that you can make inferences to that actually expands the story if you're paying attention.
Yeah, and I really appreciate when authors go like that extra level. I know it came up in one of my conversations with Annie Bennett, and how she provided some like additional layers that for people who really want to get into the story, really experience the story, she added this information. It was like you technically could, go through the story and just read it at face value and skip over some things, but it's like I feel like you kind of lose that extra layer of added value. Another question that kind of was on my mind is, this is definitely what I would consider like that epic fantasy. Like you're building a universe. You're exploring this in pretty good detail. How did you approach that? Like you mentioned in your Substack that you managed to write 160,000 words in 8 months as a book, which is, I gotta say, that's pretty good. So when you set out to write it, did you have it in your mind that you wanted it to be like an epic of like the traversing more area within the pages, or did that kind of like grow out of it as you were starting to write it?
Well, I'm sure you know as an author yourself, your original idea is never the end product. It's your starting point, right? And originally, I had planned on writing a singular book with 4 portions inside of it that when I started writing into it, I'm like, I can't compact this story that tightly. Otherwise, it's going to be an omnibus that's 3,000 pages long. You know what I mean? So I need to break this thing up into 4 separate books to really to do it justice, because and you'll probably come to this conclusion as a reader, and I'd be curious to get your take on this as one of the first readers for it, Glenn, is by the end of the first book, you may be asking, how do you even have a sequel to this? It's so shocking, the ending to it. It's like, where do you even go from this? But I've got every individual portion, those 4 portions, they were laid out as sort of a superstructure to the entire epic. And that's probably why it has that feel, is because it's not meant to be a standalone thing. This isn't meant to be the first foray into what will eventually become a self-sustaining epic project, in the same way that if, the Lord of the Rings or Narnia, whatever those epics that everybody knows about, if it stopped at the first book, they'd be like, I don't get it. Like that doesn't actually, there's no satisfaction to the end of it. And really, I knew coming into this that I wanted to write a dystopian. First of all, because Izayama wrote a dystopian, and I really vibe with the beauty of suffering. I think that suffering itself, especially in a very visceral way, something that's just tragic, is really a universal language, because you can't guarantee that everybody's experienced love, and you can't guarantee that everybody's experienced hate, but given enough time, everybody's experienced loss, whether it's personally or peripherally. And again, having that experience or presenting that experience to the reader as you do it, I think can add both veneration to the people that have experienced loss, but also have that extra experiential quality to people that haven't, that will help to build out the sociology and the humanity of the people that I'm writing about in a by proxy way. And in so doing, again, I hope to present a holistic story through the presentation of an epic that really can't be fully understood until you've read the final fourth book, which I haven't even, I barely started the second book at this point. So again, knowing starting point to ending point are going to be different, but I know everybody's got their process, and my process when I started was I need to build a superstructure. Think of it like a skeleton. I need to build a skeleton before I can discover what muscles go where, put the meat on the bones, and sort of build out what's going to be the final product, the final body by the end. And if you start with that superstructure, I found it gives me a roadmap, broadly speaking, to be able to say, well, where am I in regards to where I need to be? And for myself, I know you were having a conversation recently about the difference between a planner and a pantser, about people that just, fly by the seat of their pants, sit down at the keyboard and just see where it goes, as opposed to somebody that has to have like step by step process. I vibe with both of those, and I start with the step-by-step process, and then I basically pants it from there. And it's really worked out well for me. It keeps me on track for the total goal, because I can't not finish this the way that it needs to be finished. I know how the ending to this epic ends, and I need to stay on course for that. But there's so much human story in between now and then, and relationship and experience that is being explored by me as the author first, that I can't actually lay that out. It has to be discovered in that inspirational way.
As a reader, I can definitely vibe with with that feeling of getting to the end and just that shock of, oh my gosh, what the heck is going on here? Which I liked. I really liked the ending, and I can't wait to see what happens next, because you've built it up in such a way where it's like, you need to know. Like, it's not even want to know, you need to know what happens next. So definitely good luck on book 2 as you're writing that. Yeah, I guess another question is, you talked about your progression from, going from the philosophical to fiction. Can you talk a little bit about what led you into writing in the first place? I know, you've come from, a number of backgrounds, from your welding experience, mixed martial arts and Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And you've talked a little bit about this in other podcasts as well. But just for this audience, can you talk a little bit about what led you to get into writing in the first place, and what was that path like?
Well, I've got my own podcast that I started in 2022 that was all political. It was all sociological. It was like what was going on in the world and how I feel about it, and how it relates to things that have happened in the past and what we can learn from it. And so it was quasi-philosophical, but what it really was me trying to discover the world around me in a sort of an a priori way. Because I mean, everybody, no matter what their background is, kind of starts with I don't know what you want to call it, sort of a preloaded conception of what the world is around them, whether it is the culture they're grown up in, the language, the country, the political point of view, whatever it is. They have an idea about what the world is. And what I discovered the more I looked into it is that they're mostly, if not all, proprietary, which means they're individually built. A lot of it is onboarded from other places. And when you go out and start doing some of your own onboarding, what you're going to find is there's a vast universe of things and ideas and perspectives that you have never heard of before. And what you'll find, or what I found when I did that, doing these podcasts for, I was doing 5 a week for 2 years straight, hundreds of podcasts. And I'd bring on guests that had very different worldviews and experiences than me, and I would walk away from every episode with new thoughts in my head that I didn't have before I started. And this very strange and unexpected thing happened when I started onboarding so many new thoughts. Was, first of all, you're sort of stuck in this place of constantly trying to rationalize and re-rationalize what's in your head. But more to the point, I found subconsciously, the thoughts started talking to themselves. Now, this may sound strange, and you might want to throw me in a padded room when you start hearing me talk like this, but you have ideas that are, I don't know if antithetical is the right word, but they battle out sort of like this war of ideas in your head, whether you want to or not. If you just keep sucking through the fire hose that's blasting this information into your head, you're going to start having these emergent thoughts come out of what is the mean between all of these disparate thoughts. And what I found is it was getting to the point that it felt like I was a faucet that needed to open up. The pressure was building up behind that. I needed a release that the podcast was not just not an answer for, it was actually making it worse. So what I needed to do is have an outside outlet to push this stuff into. And I didn't want to dump it on my wife. So what I did is I dumped it into a book. And so I did a bunch of my own research into a whole bunch of topics. Like I said, my first book that I did this with was called Consciousness, Reality, and Purpose. All three of those are just absolutely expansive universes of ideas. And I set out again in the same way that I did for all of my books, is building a scaffold first. I'm going to build my skeleton. Well, I want it to be about consciousness, reality, and purpose. So those are going to be three portions of the book. Inside each portion is going to be three categories, and inside each category is going to be three chapters. So I knew before I started the first word it was going to be a 27-chapter book, 3 times 3 times 3. And I laid that out, and then I started filling in the blanks of what are the three ideas about consciousness I want in this first portion. What about the second? What about the third? And what about reality? And then what about purpose? And then I started plugging in what I wanted to talk about and then researching it from other points of view. So, I mean, we go through everything in that book from Christianity to Buddhism to Stoicism to simulation theory to, deep philosophical and psychological tropes and, the ideas of what it is to be human, and all over the place. But it was an exploration not only for the reader, but it was my own exploration. It was almost like a documentation of it. And that followed through. Now that I had a first book after that point I was still doing the podcast, and go figure, about a year after I published that book, I'm like, I got a bunch more things that I've been thinking about that I need to get out. So I did that in the second one called Layers of Truth. And it speaks a lot to what I was talking about earlier with you with the particular and specific proprietary viewpoints in the world being the subjective view that we take of the world around us. And the subtitle to the book, Layers of Truth, is Navigating the Objective from the Subjective. So it's the idea that the world's just too big, the universe is too big around us to understand it objectively. The best we can do, and what we have to do, is understand it subjectively, but then what type of quandaries does that put us in when we think we know the total truth?
Yeah, no, and I really liked I really liked how you approached it in Consciousness, Reality, and Purpose, of you trying to explore these very huge concepts from like a semi-neutral perspective of like saying, what is this, and how do we approach it, and what are the different ways that people have come to approach it. And why I liked reading that book is it really helped me to understand, your fiction work as well, to see that it's a form of exploring those concepts. It's a form of exploring those thoughts and giving people space to, come up to their conclusions of what do they think about the scenario? What is the morality of it? Who is the right and the wrong in this situation? And is that the correct thing that they should have done? I really liked pairing those two together, because they even though technically they exist in separate spaces and genre, they really complemented each other in terms of like subject matter and thought process.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of what I both experienced and discovered in the process of writing those philosophical forays plays out in the fiction, or at least that's the goal of what I want to do. I want to put the reader in the scenario of having a front row seat to a trolley problem. Trolley problems are one of my favorite things in philosophy. Is, the classic idea of you stand at the throw switch of a track, and there's a speeding trolley coming towards you, and you can send it one of two directions. On one track, 5 people are lined up on the track and will surely die if you don't throw the switch. In the other direction, if you do throw the switch, 1 person is on the track and he will surely die if you throw the switch. And of course, it comes down to moral ambiguity when you start putting into place, well, what are those 5 people on that track, or who is that 1 person on that track? When you start to go into a bunch of moral ambivalence, not only about what was the right choice when you make it, but then down the track from there's another switch, and you start piling on these trolley problems onto each other. And from the reading of this book, it starts out from a position of, I want to do what is the morally correct, obvious thing to do. And by the end of it, you're thinking, where did we end up? There were so many trolley problems that led us into something that is akin to atrocity. So how did I end up there from starting out in a morally righteous position. And this is something I think that just, it doesn't get explained well enough, often enough, and it needs to be experienced more often to give deference to the idea that maybe you don't know everything about what you know, and the difference between the two needs to be rectified before you end up doing terrible, horrible things to people on the pretense that it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, and I think this book definitely explores that well. Of characters make decisions based on what they know, and you can quickly see how after the fact they review the thing that they just did and said, why was that the outcome? You know, how am I now in this place when I set out I was over here? This is where I thought I was going, but now we're here in this other place. Yeah, it definitely hits hard on that front. And it surprised me in a number of areas where I went in, you know, like even as a reader, you know, you go in with certain expectations of books. But as a reader, I went in with expectations, and I found myself surprised in a number of ways. Some were more comedic because there's definitely a few moments that I found myself laughing in a good way. But other times I was just like shocked. It was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that just happened. I guess as we talk about this, it's like one of the things that I've found in kind of a writing space, talking about perceptions and how we kind of get into it, is the process of writing a book. I think a lot of people have kind of an assumption of what it is to write a book. You know, certain people have, you know, a mentality of, you know, this kind of idealistic, you know, sitting down with a typewriter kind of idea. What have you found from that perspective? Like, so you've now, you know, you've published two, you've got one that's on the way at the time of this recording. How have you found the experience of writing and putting those thoughts down and then going through that process of you know, refining those things?
Yeah, you got to have or at least build a very thick rhino skin if you actually plan to make it all the way to publication, because it is a gauntlet. Forget about, most people get stuck on, well, I mean, writing takes a long time and I get writer's block and I don't know where I'm going, or I get lost and I got to start over. I scrap this chapter and go. It's all about like the initial writing of it. That's the fun part. Sorry to tell you, that's actually not only the easy part, but that's the fun part. It only gets worse after that. Once you've finished your first completed manuscript, your first draft, prepare to give it to somebody and have them chop it with a battle axe. It is brutal when you send it to an editor, because they see it as an objective thing, whereas to you, it's your baby. You know, you spent however long on it, months, maybe years spent on something, to be able to give this precious thing, this suckling child, over to this horrible person that you're paying to chop it into pieces in front of you. And it just feels, you have such resentment at first when you have an editor and you start being like, I cannot believe you don't understand why I put that there. You know, when people go through a process of acceptance and they have to go through all of the stages of you know, grieving and anger and guilt and all that stuff to finally get to acceptance, you're going to have to experience that when you go through editing, because you won't actually get through the editing if you don't come to acceptance. You're going to have to believe and come to the realization that the person is trying to help you, is trying to make a better version of your work, and probably knows more about writing and grammar and diction than you do. And so you have to create what's more of a collaboration than it is an antagonistic back and forth battle about who's more right about whatever particular scene or character or wording. And it was a process for me that I wasn't expecting. I thought it was going to be more of like well, I pay this person to make my book better. I get the book that's better and I put it to publish. No, man, it is hands-on. You're in the trenches every day. Put it to you this way, Glenn. The first manuscript that I had written for Fractures in Love took me between 6 and 7 months of daily writing. So to speak to your point, 160,000 words in about 6 or 8 months, and that was daily. Daily, I was putting in hundreds, if not thousands, of words on the page every single day. And I've got a hectic life, and I still found time to do it. So, you know, pat myself on the back. I made it through the fun part. And then after that, I just yesterday finished the final edits on what is going to be the actual first edition that's going out on April 30th here. I just finished the final edit. And I remember watching an author talk about their editing process, and they counted the number of edits that they had to do, and it was something like 4,000 edits to their manuscript. And by the end of this, I was thinking, man, you must have been a really good writer, because I probably had 4 times that. It took so much work. It was 4 months. I started editing at the beginning of January and just ended near the beginning of April here by the time that it's ready to release. And it is painful. You don't want to do it. You don't want to sit down and basically be criticized and pay for it. It almost seems like it's a sadist's thing to sit down and just get criticized over and over. But you get to that point of acceptance, you know that it's going to have a good result. And I do feel like it really refined the gold, or, carved the jewel, however you want to think about it, to have a really quality outcome by the end. So I would say for authors that are getting into it now, enjoy the fun part, which is the writing. Even though it has its own struggles, it's only going to get worse after that, but there is light at the end of the tunnel, and I'm experiencing that now, and very excited for other people to read it.
You hit it on the nose there of like, it's very challenging, because as you say, you spend a lot of time crafting this thing, and I would say it's fairly difficult to separate yourself emotionally from what we write. Like, because we are inherently emotional creatures, and when we put these words on page, we're channeling kind of what's inside of us, and then to have someone, like you say, come along with a battle axe and swing away at it, it can hurt. And I remember the first time I got some feedback was from an instructor in a writing course, and she handed it back to me. I wrote this little, flash fiction, and it was covered in red ink. Like, it was just
the worst feeling ever.
Covered. Yeah, and I was just like, oh my gosh, this is terrible, because I'm used to, like how it was in, high school, and how that's just what it was like. But then the thing that she said, which really helped switch it around for me, was she said to me, I really like this, and I'm marking it up so much because I know it can be better. And it just switched in my head of like, right, you're trying to help me be better. You're not trying to, say, oh, this is terrible, or, oh, like, why are you here? Why are you writing? It's, I see potential in this. I know how to help get you there. Here's what I think could get you there. And then it was up to me really in the end to whether I applied it or not. But just that fact of like, there's a caring aspect, and it can feel brutal in that moment. But I'm glad to hear that you're, on the other side of that. And I'm sure it'll come back up again as you, work on book 2.
I've got 3 more editions coming out that I'm already dreading this process. No, but there's this feeling that comes, it's in everything, especially artistic endeavor, is this imposter syndrome feeling of like, am I actually good at this? Should I actually be spending my time doing this? Is it worth the effort? Are people going to hate it anyways? And I mean, I've had that in so many different endeavors and so many different times in my life. I'm a 42-year-old man who's gone through all sorts of different life journeys, whether, again, you were talking about welding. I was a ticketed welder for 15 years, going up the rungs of that ladder in the industry. A Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. I've been doing it for 18 years now. I've got the largest meme page on planet Earth when it comes to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, so I've got a lot of my humor out there in the world, made a lot of connections through that, and then all of a sudden people have an expectation of what I am as an athlete because I'm so popular in this space that's full of athletes. And there's always a reason to have this egoic battle in your head about, am I worthy? Should I even be doing this? And anytime that, if I were to give any unsolicited advice from my own experience, anytime that I have those thoughts come up, which is semi-regularly, I would say daily, I think back to, why am I even doing it? Was it something that I wanted to become famous for, or is it something that I don't care if anyone ever reads? And it's always been the latter for me, or whatever the question is revolving around. Is it something that I would do if nobody was watching? And to me, it's something that I wrote about in my first book. I call it The Mind of the Ant. And I had this analogy of a singular solitary ant. So ants are a very curious thing because they're a super mind. They're a super organism in that they build phenomenally engineered structures that not a single individual one of them understands. But the culmination of them builds something magical. Now, I put myself one day, sort of out of the blue, sitting on the ground watching a single ant. I put myself into the the idea sphere of what this thing is in front of me. I'm watching this tiny little creature try to navigate these rocks that must look like boulders to it along the driveway. And I'm thinking, what is driving this thing, and why is it doing what it's doing? It looks like it's very interested in doing what it's doing right now. What is in the mind of an ant that's just like insignificantly small that's driving this thing? There's no slave herder behind it cracking the whip if it doesn't work hard enough. Every single morning it goes out and just explores and I came to the conclusion, it's a very obvious conclusion. It's doing, and it has to be doing, there's not enough thinking power for it not to be doing the thing that it wants to be doing the most. That's the only motivating driver for that ant. It is, whether you call it instinct or whatever, it is doing and wants to do the thing that it wants to do the most. So if I use that as sort of an analogy for what is worth and maybe like the most valuable thing for me to do while I'm on planet Earth, it should be in line with the thing that I want to do the most. That this comes back to a lot of spiritual beliefs too. There's an interesting, I don't know if you'd call it a theory or a belief system back in the old Grecian days. I'm sure you've heard of the muse. Everybody talks about it in the artistic circles as like contacting the muse or whatever. Well, what was the muse? The muse was a form of demigod back in Grecian mythology, that the muses, I believe there were 7 of them, they would come down from Olympus or, their version of heaven or the ethereal, and would inspire or bring inspiration to the thoughts of man. And so they would come down and give great thoughts of scientific relevance, of archaeological relevance, of artistic relevance, of musical relevance. And you were thought to, back in Grecian days, if you had a fantastic inspirational idea, to have been touched by the muses. That's where we get the word muse from. It's where we get the word museum from. If you go to a museum, it's supposed to be the outcome of all of the people that have been touched by the muses. And I don't know where in reality that actually sits, but I do believe that there is something to the process of inspiration, that there is something beyond the physical that I can't explain, but when it happens, I have to have deference for it. And I feel like a lot of the thoughts and ideas that I most want to express, they may not even be mine to begin with. And in that case, I feel more like the pen of the author than I am the author himself. And so in that way, why should I care if anybody else wants to read it? It's not about me. It's about getting the ideas out there. And if I serve the pen as that process, so be it.
It's definitely a struggle and a constant debate amongst authors that I've talked to around, why am I writing? Why am I spending all this time doing this thing? And if no one reads this, like, would I be okay with that? Which I think is a question that, as an author myself, every author kind of has to explore that question themselves. But I found you really did a good job explaining it, or at least approaching it and presenting questions for people to look at within this story. And even like within your, Consciousness, Reality, and Purpose book as well, where you're presenting information and then letting people come to conclusions. And I think that's an important thing that sometimes we, I think there's like this tendency for us to want to have answers. And sometimes we ask the question and we want we think we want like a literal answer. Give me exactly what I need. Mm-hmm. But oftentimes I found that when someone gives us a literal answer, we don't accept it. We don't like it. We, think, oh, well, that can't be it. But when we're presented with, more questions or, a partial answer, then our brain kind of tries to fill that space with either the answer from ourselves or an exploration of that question. And I think this book does a really good job of doing that, of presenting a question or a partial answer and letting people populate the rest of it with their own personal experience and explore kind of these thematic questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks. That is a lot of what I was trying to do. It's nice to hear that it came through for people that were reading it so far. To give a bit of a preview, because I do give a preview at the end of the book of at least the first part of the first chapter of the second book. And to give people who have no idea what the storyline is a little bit of a taste without any spoilers, the basic premise of the first 2 books in this 4-book series is going to be from the perspective of 2 warring races, or of 2 antithetical races that are always and have been for thousands of years in opposition to each other for some reason or another. And that gets explored later into the series. But in the first book, it's going to be from the perspective of a slave race called the Theutons. And the Theutons are the slaves of their dominator race called the Rayans. And in the first book, it's basically a battle of freedom, of trying to get sovereignty back over themselves, of exploring their value and their worth, and trying to, basically get their comeuppance for being subjugated by this race against their will. Now, in the second book, what we're going to do is actually explore the exact same timeline, the exact same storyline from the first book from the opposite perspective, where now you're going to actually look at it from the Rayans' perspective, and you may actually hate them by the end of the first book because of them being the bad guy. They're just the obvious adversary to the Theutons. Well, we're going to explore it from the opposite perspective, and what that's going to do is put the reader into some very uncomfortable situations. There's actually one portion of this first book that I remember you made a comment to me about while you were reading through it, saying this was a really funny scene. And my editor actually said the same thing. She's like, I laughed actually at this part. I wasn't expecting this was a really funny scene. Now, that funny scene involves murder. And in the second book, you're going to feel really bad about laughing at that scene because you're going to know the person that they killed and realize what that actually did to the storyline in a way that's going to have to come again back to that throw switch that you threw, thinking, did I make the right choice? Should I have laughed at that? Oh my, what am I? Kind of thing. And it's a very human experience. I mean, not everybody's going to read my treatises, and I don't expect them to, but I really want to expand this to a broader audience for the purpose and the value that I think that it gives to the human experience writ large, instead of just thinking that you're always right about the decisions you and the people you agree with made. Yeah,
and I think the way that you're going about it is such an interesting approach. And it honestly was something that I was thinking as I was going through this book is, I'm very much seeing it from one perspective. And in the back of my head, I was wondering, what's the other's perspective? Like, what's going on in the with the Rayans? And it's like, yeah, I assume, because I'm from the main character's perspective, that they're the good guys, quote unquote, and that the other characters are the bad guys, quote unquote. But then, yeah, when you're going through the different things that happen in the story, you really start to wonder, are we the good guys? Are they the good guys? What is good in this scenario? And yeah, it's definitely going to be an interesting second book. And I guess for the sake of my own safe-facedness of I did laugh. I do have a weird sense of humor. I will probably regret laughing because of what you just said.
It was meant to make you laugh. I laughed while I was writing it.
Oh, crud. I'm really curious to see how you approach that in book 2. I guess we've talked about some of the struggles that you've gone through and some of the challenges of writing. What would you say is something that you found is something that's really core that's helped push through all those challenges, or what's something that's really kept you going as you've been facing the different obstacles of getting to publishing the story?
Yeah, it's a serious struggle to try to validate yourself when there's nobody else there to do it for you. Human beings were so apt to get our personal worth from other people's opinions about it, which is maybe the worst way to do it, right? Because it's going to fly with the wind, and it's going to depend on their own egos and their own intentions, their own personality, less than it is about you and who you are on your own. But being that that's the case, it's a very lonely road when you're writing, and you're basically front row seat in an empty theater to what you feel is the best story you've ever seen, to the best movie you've ever witnessed, and you have nobody to nudge beside you saying, isn't that really cool, or what do you think about that? And you won't for months, maybe years, before you might get somebody who saw some bit of it or gets an early copy, and you're just begging for them to be like, what do you think? What part did you like? Is it good? Give me something, And I feel like part of what drove me to completion during all of the periods, like months long periods, about why am I doing this? Is this worth it? Is anybody going to like it? Was the waiting for the point that, well, I'm not going to know that answer until I get to the end. So I got to get to the end to be able to know that answer. And maybe everyone's going to hate it, but at least I will have some closure on it. Give me some sort of catharsis at the end of this struggle bus session, you know?
You know, stories like yourself and the other authors that I've interviewed, I think that's kind of like the the inspiration that I've been taking away, and I hope other people have as well, is like, you know, writing is a challenging process. It's fun. There's a lot of things that I enjoy about writing, but there's a lot of challenges to it too. But talking with, you know, published authors like yourself is to see that, you know, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. There is a book that people will read and people will enjoy. Maybe, you know, not everybody. Maybe it'll be a handful. Maybe it'll be 1,000. You don't know until, you know, you get it out there and you get feedback. But there is a light, and that you have shown that you're able to get a book out there and to have people read it and to have people enjoy that. And that's inspirational, honestly, because it is a challenge to get there. But seeing other people have like done it before, can really encourage other people. And I hope that, you know, with these podcasts, that's a takeaway that people get, is that it is doable. You know, you can write your story, you can finish your book, and you can get it out there.
Yeah, you're doing good work, Glenn. I really appreciate what you're doing and why you're doing it. As an author yourself, you know, it is a selfless thing to try to focus on other people instead of yourself. And that's, you know, it's a good thing in the world, and we need more people like that.
Indeed. Well, I'm certainly one of many that are trying to do my part. Because like, you know, we've talked about, is the author journey is challenging. So I've identified a few different ways that I know would help other authors, and I'm trying to do, you know, what little I can. I guess turning the the spotlight back to yourself, where can people find you? Like, what's the place that, you know, if people read the book and they want to get in touch with you or learn more about the book, what's the best place for people to go to?
For me, the easiest thing is Instagram. It's the only social media I use, more or less. I've got a bunch of different accounts on there, but I've got a personal account and an author account. And either of those, if you jump into the DMs, you're likely to get a response. So you can check me out on Instagram for my personal page, which is mostly my jiu-jitsu, which is drew.weatherhead. Or you can check out my author account, which is drew.w.author. And check that out. And yeah, I'm really excited to finally get to the release of this. It will be out by the time this podcast goes out, so check it out on Amazon. It's in all versions. You got your hard copy, your paperback, and your digital. And hit me up once you've done reading it and let me know what you think.
I'll include links to, you know, the things that you mentioned, and a few that I referenced as well. If people are looking to explore a very interesting approach to fantasy and an epic fantasy, definitely would check this one out. You can also check out Drew's other works if you're looking to kind of think about life from a different perspective and explore some of the deeper questions of life. And definitely would recommend that for some of the people like myself who like to think about, you know, what is life and how to approach it and whatnot. But we'll call it there for now. And yeah, definitely check Drew out on social media. Reach out to him, and hope everyone has a good rest of your day.